Lecture 15, we looked carefully at Aristotle's and Thomas Aquinas' doctrines of moral virtue, one of the most crucial aspects of their moral philosophies considered as a whole. As we may recall, the Aristotelian and Thomistic teaching is rooted in the observation that human beings are essentially rational animals. And so what perfects us as human beings, what contributes to our excellence as human beings, is to act according to reason. This is the insight behind Aristotle's famous claim that moral virtue is a mean between two extremes, as, for example, generosity is the mean between stinginess, giving too little to others, and extravagance, giving too much to others. The truly generous person gives the right amount to the right people at the right time, under the right conditions, in the right manner, etc. And so that same virtuous person must know, through the application of reason, how to discern the right amounts, people, times, conditions, and manners before he develops the virtuous habit of generosity, inclining him to act accordingly. Throughout Aristotle's writings, we definitely get the impression that some virtues are more important than others. Justice, for instance, appears to be more central to what it means to be a virtuous person than, say, wittiness. Thomas Aquinas, however, hearkening back to an even older teaching, stemming from Plato and the ancient Stoic philosophers, tells us that there are primarily four cardinal moral virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, and fortitude. That prudence is a cardinal virtue is in many ways obvious from the fact that virtue requires practical knowledge of how to act in certain situations in accordance with the other virtues. And we will discuss justice in the following lecture. In this lecture, though, we will consider temperance and fortitude, both crucial habits of the soul for the constitution of a virtuous character. Like all moral virtues, temperance, also called moderation or self-control, is a mean between two extremes. And so to understand temperance, we must know what those extremes are, as well as the particular sphere of human life to which it applies. Remember that genuinely human virtues deal with spheres of human life that are universal to human beings. So even though one might be skilled at playing chess or solving a Rubik's Cube, these skills cannot be counted as real virtues. However, one dimension of human nature that is universal is what Thomas Aquinas calls concupiscence, which is essentially a desire for pleasure that we find in our soul's sensitive appetite, which, you might recall from Lecture 16, lies beneath our rational appetite, or our will. Because we are animals, we have powerful desires and urges that are part of our concupiscence. But because we are rational animals, we also have the ability to control those desires, to see the genuine human goods to which they direct us, and to govern them in accordance with reason. But from the perspective of identifying what exactly temperance is, Aristotle and Aquinas both argue that reason is more commonly needed for regulating certain forms of concupiscence more than others. To be sure, concupiscence always involves a desire for pleasure. But the most powerful pleasures, and the ones most in need of regulating, are bodily pleasures. But not even just any bodily pleasures. As Aristotle famously argues, when we talk about temperance or moderation, we are normally talking about bodily pleasures associated with the sense of touch. And yet we can even narrow it down still further, because, as Aristotle says, we're not accustomed to calling people temperate who regulate their desires for massages or warm baths. No, the pleasures of touch about which temperate people are temperate essentially boil down to two: food and drink on the one hand, and the pleasure of sex on the other. The desire for these pleasures of touch are ubiquitous. Everyone feels them, and everyone needs a strong habit of character in order to deal with them, as a rational and good human being would. Before we proceed further, it might be worth asking why Aristotle and Aquinas identified the pleasure of eating and drinking as a pleasure of touch and not taste. To be sure, they would concede that taste plays an important role. As Aristotle notices, though, the real pleasure of eating a sumptuous meal is actually in the swallowing of the food. The food's taste, we might say, creates and excites a greater expectation of the swallowing, but the swallowing remains what we might call the ultimate pleasure moment. For this reason, Aristotle casually makes a reference to the well-known and perhaps gluttonous gourmet who, quote, prayed for a throat longer than a crane's. In any case, though, having identified what temperance is essentially about, we may also ask, if it's truly a moral virtue, how is it a mean between two extremes? What are those extremes? When it comes to temperance, this question is somewhat more difficult to answer than in other virtues. On one hand, one might easily identify the extreme vice by way of excess. We simply would call it self-indulgence. So the self-indulgent person eats and drinks to excess. He eats and drinks too much. His desire for the pleasure of food and drink is unbridled, unchecked by any rational limitation on those pleasures. But consistency requires that there must also be a vice by way of deficiency, which would be exhibited by those who do not enjoy concupiscible pleasures enough. So those who shun pleasure inordinately are likewise intemperate, but for the opposite reason. Now, granted, the vice by way of excess, self-indulgence, is vastly more common than the vice by way of deficiency, which is so rare that Aristotle admits that there really isn't even a name for it. Rare, though, does not mean non-existent. And perhaps even more importantly, for Aristotle and Aquinas to condemn those who excessively shun the bodily pleasures of touch is to remind us that these pleasures are not in themselves evil. Even though we share them with irrational animals, they remain part of our human nature, and they even point us in the direction of genuine goods. In understanding the human person as a rational animal, then, it's a mistake to think of our rational side as the good side and the animal side as the bad side. Just as all of creation is good at the most basic metaphysical level, so also every level of human nature is good, though prone to perversion and disorder. And reason is just as capable of succumbing to that disorder as the bodily or animal dimension of our nature. In thinking clearly about the virtue of temperance, though, one must be careful to avoid the mistake of using too strict a definition of concepts like too much or too little. In discussing this virtue, Aristotle is fond of referring to a famous wrestler in his own day by the name of Milo. Milo, it seems, was a very large man who, presumably, we may surmise, burned many calories per day as a competitive athlete, and so consumed a large amount of food as well. Now, obviously, what constitutes too much food or drink for Milo will be different from what constitutes too much for a diminutive 90-pound grandmother. But this does not mean that temperance for Milo is something entirely different from what it means for others to be temperate. And this is where Thomas Aquinas' insights are especially helpful. For both Milo and the 90-pound grandmother, what it means to eat and drink in a temperate manner is to eat and drink in accordance with what reason can discern is the natural purpose or function of eating and drinking in the first place. So why do human beings have such a powerful desire to eat and drink? Because, we may surmise, God wisely attached the greatest physical pleasure to those activities that are most essential for the preservation of our lives and our physical health. And so, he reasons, to eat and drink in a virtuous, that is to say, temperate way, is to do so such as is necessary to sustain one's life and health. To eat more than is necessary for these good and natural ends, or to eat in a way that is altogether inconsistent with them, is by definition to eat immoderately, contrary to the virtue of temperance. The same logic is applied to sexual pleasure. Aside from whatever personal or subjective reasons one might have for indulging in sexual pleasure, an objective look at its meaning in the context of human nature reveals that the purpose of human sexuality is procreation, the generation of new human life. So a lustful person is not just someone who has a great deal of sex, just as the glutton is not simply he who eats a great deal. Rather, the lustful man or woman is one whose sexual activity is not directed to, or at least is not open to, the reason for which we have sexual desires in the first place. Aquinas would identify this as a classic example of the natural law, which of course goes hand in hand, not just with the virtue of temperance, but with all the moral virtues humans can acquire. So, to have sex in such a way that severs the sexual act from procreation is inherently contrary to the natural law and is intemperate. And hence Aquinas would condemn, as Plato, Aristotle, and nearly every major philosopher before him condemned, sexual perversions, such as homosexuality, masturbation, and bestiality, which are inherently incapable of procreation, as well as simple fornication, or what we would today call premarital sex, which may result in procreation, but under harmful and unnatural conditions. Right away, two things are worth pointing out about this teaching. First, the virtue of temperance, defined as that which regulates our desires for the pleasures of touch, specifically has to do with what we might call the vital pleasures of human nature. Pleasures, that is, that are necessary for sustaining human life. But they do this in different ways. Obviously, every human being needs to eat and drink for their survival. And so every human being must engage in the pleasurable actions of eating and drinking. On the other hand, not every human being needs to have sex and procreate in order for the human race to go on existing. In fact, it's quite healthy and reasonable that a good portion of the human race not do this. So as it would be unnatural and harmful for an individual person to abstain entirely from food and drink, it would not necessarily be wrong, given the natural end or purpose of human sexuality, for certain individuals to remain celibate, that is, not to engage in sexual activity at all. Nor would the decision to remain celibate imply in any way that there is something low or base about human sexuality. It's simply a fact that not everyone needs to participate in it. In fact, Aquinas' teaching about the virtue of temperance only makes sense on the assumption that human sexuality is something natural and good. It is, we might say, precisely because of the fact that human sexuality is natural and good that is what makes it wrong to partake of it out of accordance with its nature. Homosexuality, masturbation, and fornication are considered perversions precisely because what is being perverted is a great human good with a discernible and objective end determined by nature itself, and of course, God, the author of nature. So it would be wrong to think that Aquinas' upholding of what we might call traditional sexual mores is rooted in some kind of prudishness or anti-humanism. Quite the contrary. On his reasoning, it's only because human sexuality is profoundly good, natural, and necessary that its abuse is profoundly bad. So when we speak of temperance or moderation, Aristotle and Aquinas would both agree that we are speaking primarily about how the human person deals with the powerful, vital pleasures associated with consuming food and drink and sex. Nevertheless, the virtue of temperance may be applied to other things as well. In a sense, any time our reason is confronted with the task of regulating our natural desires, we are called upon to exercise the virtue of temperance. This even applies, says Aquinas, to our natural desire for knowledge. As Aristotle says in the opening lines of his Metaphysics, all men by nature desire to know. But just like our sexual desires, the desire for knowledge can be pursued in a well-ordered or disordered way. So even though knowledge is a great human good, one might pursue knowledge simply so that he can boast about how intelligent he is. Or he might pursue knowledge at the expense of fulfilling more pressing moral obligations. Or he might go wrong in some other way. The virtue that orders our desire for knowledge well, Aquinas calls studiousness. And again, because studiousness regulates a natural desire, the desire for knowledge, it falls under the cardinal virtue of temperance. A similar point is made by Aquinas when it comes to the phenomenon of anger and the corresponding virtue. Anger is a special case because when we're angry, our anger is naturally accompanied by a desire for some kind of retaliation. We cannot be angry unless, on some level, we believe an injustice has been done and that someone must pay for that injustice. This is why Aristotle and Aquinas both believe anger can be both natural and good, as is the accompanying desire for just recompense. But here again, this desire can be well-ordered or disordered. One might become angry to the point of desiring revenge that is altogether excessive. Or even if it's not, the anger itself might simply become excessively fierce. The virtue of meekness or mildness, therefore, a virtue that falls under the umbrella of temperance, is necessary to ensure that anger is properly ordered. So human beings, rational animals that we are, require the virtue of temperance to regulate our desires, and especially what Aquinas calls the concupiscible desires of our sensitive appetite. This part of our soul, called the sensitive appetite, however, also has another dimension. Not only is it concupiscible, it is also at times irascible. Now here, admittedly, the language gets a little confusing. The word irascible is derived from the Latin word ira, which means anger. As Aquinas argued, however, that aspect of anger which requires the regulation of a virtue is that part which desires revenge or retribution. But there are also passions of the soul that are not really associated with this desire at all, such as hatred and fear. And for these, a different moral virtue is required. And this is the moral virtue Aquinas calls fortitude or courage. So when we hate something or fear something, we're not really desiring anything in the hatred or fear itself. Still, these passions must be in accordance with reason in a human person in pursuit of moral excellence. So fear, like anger, is not morally bad in and of itself. As there are things that we should naturally be angry about, there are things we are wise to fear, as well as things like death we just can't help but fearing. But this fear, while at times very helpful, can become an obstacle in the performance of our duties or just in the pursuit of our highest good. So the man who stands up to fear and does not allow fear to consume him is courageous. More specifically, the courageous man executes his duty, most characteristically as a soldier in battle, in spite of the fear that he feels and which threatens to make him shrink from his duty. Aristotle and Aquinas both seem to agree that courage is thus the highest form of fortitude, since the fear of death in particular is the most powerful irascible passion there is, the most difficult to order by our reason. But like all virtues, courage is also a mean between two extremes. The extreme by way of deficiency is what we might call cowardice. Those who are deficient in courage too easily give in to fear and run away from the good they are pursuing or protecting. On the other hand, one might also become reckless in the midst of fearful or dangerous situations. This would mean not recognizing when, in fact, it might be prudent to drop one's weapons and run. Or it might mean that the reckless man, instead of running away, and also instead of standing his ground and fighting, runs wildly into the enemy in battle, crazily waving his sword. The idea here is that because he can't control his fear, he's forced to suspend rationality altogether in order to overcome it. But in reality, he doesn't really overcome it as the courageous man does. He just temporarily becomes like a wild animal, since if he didn't, he would probably just run away like a coward. So the extremes in this case, as in others, have something in common, namely the inability to deal rationally with fear and to overcome that fear as a rational agent. The coward runs from fear and from dangerous situations. The reckless man, in a sense, simply chooses death as an escape from that danger. This is why Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, distinguishes between genuine courage and certain character traits that merely resemble courage. So the citizen soldier who is compelled to fight against his will might look like he's courageously standing up to fear, but in fact his actions are actually motivated by fear, not of the enemy, but of his commanding officers. Secondly, expertise in facing dangers is not exactly the same thing as courage. The reason for this is that some professional soldiers are so skilled in battle that the danger of their actual death is significantly reduced. And so, Aristotle reasons, they simply don't have as much to fear, which is something different than overcoming one's fear as the courageous man does. Third, those who fight from a spirited temper are not truly courageous. Again, this is reminiscent of the vice Aristotle calls recklessness. And so he says that such men, quote, in a fit of temper, become like wild beasts and turn on those who have wounded them. Fourthly, those who stand up to danger out of optimism are not necessarily courageous either. For the truly courageous man fights in spite of danger that lies ahead, not because he's confident in the prospects of victory, because of his side's superior numbers or military skill. This is also related to the fifth version of counterfeit courage, which merely arises out of being ignorant of the danger one faces. Such people might give the impression of courage, but as Aristotle explains, once the ignorant realize that the situation is not what they suspected it was, they are deceived and run away. So these two virtues, temperance and fortitude, are among the cardinal virtues because they are able to regulate the irrational part of our soul, the sensitive appetite, that part of us that we have in common with many other animals. Other animals, however, because they do not possess rationality or a will, cannot have these virtues. They simply give in to their strongest passions, whatever those passions may be. Humans, on the other hand, through an act of reasoning and the exercise of prudent judgment, can act virtuously in spite of the fact that their strongest passions might be inclining them to do otherwise. The temperate person, the courageous person, is thus poised to pursue the highest good, even when the powerful desires and aversions of the animalistic part of human nature threaten to lead them astray.